So you'll have to unmute yourselves, but can you see the A Poor Missouri Farm Boy screen?
Yes, but I've still got, now I've got that gray rectangle again blocking.
Well, that's because I'm looking at your names on my.
Got it. Okay.
It should be gone now, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, so a little bit
Yes.
about Truman today. Of course, this class we're going to focus on sort of Truman's background, his family life, and then next time we'll talk more about his political career. It seems pretty condensed for 2 sessions, but we do what we can here. So first up, a little bit about Harry Truman as a boy. Of course, that's Truman in my picture there. He always had those spectacles. One reason he didn't have a whole lot of friends growing up is because he was kind of a geeky kind of kid. Born on May 8th, 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, to John and Martha Truman. He had a couple of siblings, Vivian, who is a brother, and Mary Jane, who was, of course, his sister. Vivian is kind of an unusual name these days for a boy, but it was pretty common in the 1800s. And the first thing people usually ask me about Harry Truman is with S with no period. Well, Truman didn't have a middle name. He just had the S as an initial for a middle name, I guess you could say. And it was a compromise between his 2 grandfathers' names. Solomon Young and Anderson Shipp Truman were his grandfathers, and they couldn't decide, I guess, what to give him for a middle name, so they just left the S there. Truman himself often put the period after it, even though most people think it would be appropriate to have no period because it doesn't stand for anything. Technically, if you're going by, Chicago Manual of Style form, which is what historians use in citations, it should have a period after it, even though it doesn't actually stand for anything. So Truman's youth. So in Missouri, moved several times. They weren't a very wealthy family by any means. They were actually quite poor. And so they kind of moved around wherever work took the family, you could say. So first, let's see, they moved to a farm near Grandview, which is actually owned by his grandfather, Solomon Young, one of them. And they lived here for a few years. And in 1890, this is when they first moved to Independence, Missouri. And this would become Truman's hometown, as he usually calls it. And so he'll go to school in Independence, Missouri. He will meet the love of his life in Independence, Missouri. She's also from there. But in 1902, right after high school ends, they'll actually move to Kansas City, which is nearby if you've ever been out to that area. Independence today is seen as kind of a suburb of Kansas City. So they're pretty close. Of course, very separate back then. So I mentioned that Independence is where he sort of settles in. And it's important because that's where he meets Bess Wallace, who we'll also talk quite a bit about today. That's Truman's wife, the love of his life. He actually meets her in First Presbyterian Church's Sunday school. He was 6 and she was 5 for the first time. And it made quite an impression on young Harry. Let's see if I can get my quote to show up there. Years later, he said, "I saw a beautiful curly-haired girl there. I thought, and I still think, she was the most beautiful girl I ever saw. She had tanned skin, blonde hair, gold in the sunshine, and the most beautiful blue eyes I've ever seen or ever will see." So quite the taken in by Bess Truman, Bess Wallace at that point. Now a little bit about Independence. It wasn't a very big town, about 6,000 people when Truman was there as a boy. And it is also the start of the Oregon and Santa Fe trails. So again, if you've ever gone out that way, they have, signposts marking where you would have started on those trails. So here you can see one of young Harry's report cards. Not bad. Truman himself would say that he was sort of a middling student, somewhere in the middle, not bad, not great. But he attended public schools in Independence, as I mentioned, and he graduates from high school in 1901. Now I mentioned the glasses and Truman not having a lot of friends. It was true. It kind of made him the oddball during those days. He had glasses from the time he was a young child. It was a lifelong affliction, poor eyesight. And his mother also wouldn't let him roughhouse because of his glasses. Didn't want him to break them, of course. Glasses were expensive. So as a result, he just didn't do the typical things that boys would do. Instead, he took up piano and became very good at playing piano. In fact, he even thought about doing it professionally for a while. Here I've got a little clip.
I'll show them what it sounds like.
So you can hear there, he wasn't too bad of a piano player. I couldn't imagine what would have happened if Truman had decided to go into music and go into politics. We never would have had a President Harry Truman, I suppose. So there's lots of clips out there of him playing piano at all sorts of big events in the future with all sorts of famous people, because of course, once he becomes president, he's famous as well. And he did love to play the piano. Also, nefariously, he's a very avid reader. Part of that, of course, is attributed to this childhood sort of without friends and kind of staying at home a lot and not hanging out with other boys his own age. He also had diphtheria when he was in 2nd grade, and he was kind of paralyzed for a number of months. And so he took to reading a lot during that period. And this is kind of where his love of reading came from. And Harry Truman wasn't an especially well-educated man. He completed high school, he didn't go to college. He tried to go to business school for about a semester and then had to quit because he didn't have enough money to continue going. But he did read voraciously. So on any topic, read thousands and thousands of books in his lifetime. And if you ever visit his home in Independence, of course, the library there, the Truman Library, you can see some of his private collection. And it's just all sorts of things. He just loved to read. So he kind of educates himself in that way. He didn't have the same education that many presidents do. He wasn't a professional. He didn't have a career very much so before politics. But he does know a lot about many things as a result of his reading habits. So after leaving high school, I mentioned he doesn't go to college. He works a number of sort of odd jobs, you could say. He works for a while in railroad construction as a contractor. He works in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star. He works as a clerk in 2 different Kansas City banks. And in 1906, he ends up returning to Grandview, that farm that his grandfather owned, to help his father and his brother run what is now the family farm. So he works for a farmer there. He does the bookkeeping, he does manual labor for about a decade or so. He really doesn't like it. He's pretty honest about that. He was just helping out the family. And after Dad passes away in 1914, he kind of starts to get away from that farm and move on to other things. So one of the things that Truman had wanted to do, and we'll talk more about it here shortly, is he always wanted to join the military. And today I think this is not such a common thought amongst young people, but certainly in Truman's era and even for much of the time after that until we get to the Vietnam era. It was pretty common for young men to look at the military as a real option for what to do with their life, especially someone like Truman, who wasn't going to college, who didn't have that kind of financial backing. The military seemed like a great option. Unfortunately, his eyesight kept him out of joining West Point and really going into the military the way he figured he would. So he kind of looked at that as an unfortunate stop to him joining the military. As we'll find out later, he does get in, a little different means of getting there though. So we mentioned Bess Wallace. He meets at a very young age for the first time and then kind of moves around, ends up back in Independence during his school years and gets to know Bess even better. They're close in age, different grades, but of course the same schools, so they get to know each other. 1910 is when Truman begins courting Bess officially, you could say. And they date for quite a while. Elizabeth Virginia Wallace was her given name. She's usually called Bess, sometimes Bessie as well. Now, Bess Wallace was born and raised in Independence, Missouri. And David and Margaret Wallace were her parents. And they were quite well off initially. So she came from money, you could say, much different than Harry Truman. David Wallace was a very nice man, very kind, had great visions of himself being involved in politics, which never quite pan out. Unfortunately for Mr. Wallace, politics were just bad timing for him. He never quite came across the right position at the right time. And he also tended to be kind of a heavy drinker. So that as well kind of kept him out of any big positions in politics. He did hold one position as the county treasurer for a little while. So as you can imagine, Mrs. Wallace isn't too thrilled by the fact that her husband is dead set on politics and not very good at it, as it would appear, and he also is drinking too much. So of course he doesn't have great financial regularity. As a result, he can't seem to hold a job because he sees his jobs as being in politics, and that never quite happens. So as a result, the family kind of loses a lot of that initial wealth that they had. Now, they still live in a very nice house in Independence. They're actually going to move in with their grandparents at one point. And they kind of appear to have wealth, but they really lose it at this point because of Bess's father. He just can't seem to hold on to that. So there were 4 children in the family. And Mrs. Wallace, so Bess's mom, really kind of turns back to her own father for financial support, her own parents. So she kind of abandons her husband a little bit and kind of gives up on him, you could say. Bess is the eldest of the 5 siblings. There's 3 brothers and a sister. I've got a picture here of Bess with her brothers right there. And you can see between Bess, who's kind of in the middle of the frame there, and her brothers, that there is quite a bit of a big age gap between some of them. So I mentioned issues, of course, at home between her parents. Bess's mother eventually began kind of going on long vacations with one of her sisters and ends up pretty much abandoning the family, believe it or not. She just kind of disappears and goes on these trips and is gone. So in her 20s, Bess actually ends up basically taking over raising her siblings. Her father ends up committing suicide around that same time. Bess is kind of left in charge of the family. Even though she's only 20-something at that point. So a little bit about her. She does attend those Independence public schools, as I mentioned, just like Harry, and that's where they meet and get to know one another. And they were all privately tutored in Latin, and it was kind of a small group, so they really got to know each other personally, I guess, at that point, you could say. And Bess, you can look at a picture there in her younger years. She was kind of stout and small. She was strong, so she's very good at sports. She was a good athlete. She played tennis and baseball in school. Unlike Harry Truman, of course, who probably didn't have the luxury of playing any sports because his mother didn't want him to break his glasses. And of course, as most girls did during that time, she attended finishing school over in neighboring Kansas City, Missouri, and wanted to attend college. Bess is a pretty smart woman. She's pretty outspoken as well, which is probably one of the reasons that Harry likes her. And she wanted to attend college, but her father had too much debt, so she wasn't able to go. So once the turmoil with her parents happens and she's busy kind of raising her siblings, they end up moving in with her mother's parents in Independence. Bess lived in that house until her death. Once Harry and Bess are married, they will also live in that house with her grandmother and mother until their death. So you can imagine that was probably awkward, but that is what happened. So on this slide, I put the infamous cake plate, which is kind of an interesting story. So if you ever visit Independence, it still has very much a small town feel, even though Kansas City is right next door. In the house where Bess Wallace lived, her grandparents' house, where her and her mother lived, and later on her and Harry and their family would live, is right across the street from another house known as the Nolan house, where the Nolans lived. And these were cousins of Harry Truman's. So after high school, they kind of parted ways. They didn't see each other in school anymore. And Truman's family moved to Kansas City for a while there before moving to Grandview. Well, Truman would occasionally come back to Independence and stay with the Nolans, his cousins, because it was conveniently right across from Bess Wallace's house. And of course, he knew even from the time he was a young child, supposedly, that this was the woman he was going to marry. So very convenient for him that his cousin lives right across the street. So at one point, his cousins, the mother of the household, had a cake plate that needed to be returned to Mrs. Wallace. So Harry, as the story goes, of course, took this and bounded across the street to go over just for the chance to talk to Bess Wallace. And this is kind of how they end up getting together, supposedly, as the story goes. Harry did propose to Beth a couple of times. The first time, I believe, was in 1911, so only a year or so after they started courting. And she said no. But she does eventually say yes, and they end up getting married right after he returns from World War I. And as I mentioned, of course, she lives with her mother and grandmother. Once they end up getting married, they will move in with them, so Harry will move in too. So as you can see in my picture here, obviously that's Truman as a young man in the military, in the Army. He does make it into the service, not through West Point, but through a different way. So he joined the National Guard after high school as sort of a way to be involved in this sort of military-esque group. And it was great for him because he ended up meeting friends for the first time, really, guys that were his own age, and ended up kind of creating some lifetime friendships out of it. But so what happens when World War I rolls around in 1917 is that the National Guard is federalized or militarized. So Truman, as a result, ends up being sworn into the regular Army for service as a member of what becomes the 129th Field Artillery Regiment. So it had been kind of his National Guard group, and then they become official Army. So Truman, in the Army, ends up becoming a captain. And he's very well liked by his men. He is very honest and he's a good commander. Under Truman's command in France, his battery did not end up losing a single member, which was pretty impressive. They did see action in both the Vosges Mountains and the Argonne campaign, which was one of the last major engagements of the war. So war was pretty important to Truman because it gave him that experience of bonding with other men his own age, becoming friends with other men, creating friends. And it also kind of gave him some important sort of networks to work within as he gets into politics a little bit later on. So he ends up being kind of a farmer at first, and then has some business ventures, which are pretty unsuccessful. We'll talk about that in a minute here. But Truman achieved a war record and leadership experience that made him commendable. His post-war political career in Missouri is really a result of him being so successful in the Army. And of course, he also meets those friends, and this creates kind of an instant political base. Because the hardest part, of course, when you run for a political office is having people vote for you. If you already have a number of people that are connected with a number of more people that know you, you're going to end up getting a certain number of votes to begin with. So that's going to end up helping Truman in some of his first political moves. So did anybody have any questions so far? You have to unmute yourselves. Nope, nobody? I guess I'll move on. I can't see you, so. So here is a picture of the young couple when they decided to get married, June 28, 1919. This ends up being about a month after Truman gets back after his time in World War I. And does anybody know where they honeymooned? Want to take a guess? I heard somebody.
Niagara Falls.
Niagara Falls is a good guess. Anybody else?
Independence, Missouri.
One heck of a honeymoon to not go anywhere.
Well, that was why I thought it might be the obvious answer that nobody would get.
Nope, they actually honeymooned in Michigan, on Lake Huron, Detroit, and Chicago areas. They traveled around a little bit in the Midwest, was their big honeymoon. And as I mentioned, of course, they'll go back to Independence and they will move into Bess Wallace's mother and grandmother's home, which is called the Gates House or the Gates Mansion. Their last name was Gates.
It is. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So of course, it's time for Truman to be a family man. And of course, they had intentions of having a big family. Bess Wallace had basically raised her siblings and was used to a lot of kids in the house. So she wanted a big family herself. Oops. But it just wasn't in the cards for the Trumans. They do end up having one daughter, Margaret, or Margie, as they call her with the hard G, born in 1924 in February. Bess suffered a couple of miscarriages, and she was 30 when she does finally have Margie. So this is the only child that they will end up having together. And of course, she is just the apple of their eyes, and they dote over her. At 30, of course, you're considered an older parent. At that point in time, I was older than that when I had my son, so I'm an older parent now, I guess. But because they're older parents, I mean, they just love Margie. And they will spend a lot of time together as a family. Even once Margaret is an adult, they will spend a lot of time doing things together. They're very, very close and will remain that way their entire lives. Truman also spent a good deal of time defending Margie. In the beginning, if you heard that singing, that was Margaret singing. She was well known as a singer, although she did have some musical critics. In 1950, one Washington Post music critic by the name of Paul Hume wrote that Truman was extremely attractive on the stage. He's talking about Margaret here, but cannot sing very well. She's flat a good deal of the time, and still cannot sing with anything approaching professional finish. Now, of course, this just enraged Truman. He is known as having a bit of a hot temper, so he ends up writing back, "Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beefsteak for black eyes, and perhaps a supporter below." So of course you couldn't dare say anything bad about Margaret. Truman would certainly jump to her defense there right away. What did you guys think about the singing in the beginning? Any good?
Not that special.
Not that special. Yeah, I mean, I didn't think it was like the worst singing I've ever heard, but not necessarily professional either. Margaret spends a lot of time performing places. This was actually her performance at Constitution Hall that gets criticized so poorly here. And so this kind of brings up one of the characteristics of Harry Truman that is sort of endearing, but also kind of unique, is that he did have kind of a hot temper. And, you know, he's known for writing these very sort of specific letters to people that he becomes angry at for whatever reason. Newspaper editors a lot of time got nasty letters from Truman. Sometimes even once he's president, he writes letters when he's angry at, you know, foreign dignitaries and all sorts of people. And he gets in this habit of writing the letter out, but then he never sends them. This was kind of his way of getting it all out on paper. But of course, he probably knew in the end, hey, I probably shouldn't send that to the actual person. So if you go to the Truman Library, you can read a lot of these letters, and some of them are just outrageous, what he writes. But that was kind of his method of dealing with that temper, I suppose. He didn't want to completely go off on somebody who was probably important in politics, so he got it all out in paper, and hopefully that kind of calmed it down a little bit. But here, of course, he did write to that critic and defend Margaret. And so here you can see Truman's business venture. This is a haberdashery that he opens up with one of his friends from the Army, a guy named Eddie Jacobson. And haberdashery sells hats and, you know, men's goods. You can see some ties hanging up there and all sorts of things. It wasn't horribly successful. They opened this up in Kansas City. And they run it for a few years, but there is a recession, of course, It causes it to go bankrupt. It can't survive that. But forget about the haberdashery. That really didn't matter. What mattered was it gave Truman the chance to, again, meet more people, this time in the role of a businessman. So that's kind of a little different angle. You're meeting different types of people in that position. And he also ends up joining a lot of civic organizations out of this because he is in business. So suddenly you need to join those business groups and different groups around the town and city. And he also meets lots of veterans in different veterans groups that he joins as well. So during this point, he kind of becomes known, first of all, for being that successful war veteran, but also for being, you know, an honest and hardworking man, right? Even though his business wasn't necessarily successful in the end, right? People don't remember that about Harry. They remember that he always worked hard no matter what he was doing. And this will end up serving him well in politics. And it'll end up being kind of the reason why he gets his start in politics too. Now, Bess Truman was probably Harry's biggest supporter throughout their lives. In politics or business. Here in the haberdashery, she often did the books and would help out doing stocking and inventory after hours if need be. And when Truman becomes a senator, in this picture he's a senator by that point, he becomes the Senate committee chairman, and he actually hires his wife to work as an office clerk. Now she not only answered constituent mail, she also edits his committee reports and speeches, and he travels around the nation in his committee role, but she managed the Senate office while he was away. Of course, Mrs. Truman was also an advisor to her husband. She read the congressional record every day. She served as an unnamed pro-Truman source for newspaper reporters. And Senator Truman needed her full effort, full time, and so that's why he hired her as a full salaried staff member. Using federal salary appropriation. Of course, you can imagine that garnered some criticism when he did it, but he kind of held fast to it. He said, this is the right move. She's important. I need her to do this for me. And so within a year, her salary rose from $2,280 a year to $4,500. So she must have been very good at her job. So in Independence in the Kansas City area, Truman continues to work hard, continues to do a number of different jobs, whatever needs to be done to support his family. Hence why Harry Truman is such a hard worker. He really doesn't have any particular skills. Happened to open a business with a friend, that didn't work out. Goes back to working in banks, whatever he needs to do to earn a living. Basically, he's got a young daughter now to take care of as well. Politics never really crossed his mind. He didn't start out as a young man or as a kid saying, I want to be president of the United States one day. Certainly for somebody with a fairly poor background and with no real education outside of public school, did that probably ever occur to him that it would happen. But as it turns out, Harry Truman wasn't great at business. He wasn't great at many things, but he was pretty great at politics. So as soon as someone recognizes this and he ends up getting into his first position, this is all downhill from there, right? And he goes on to become a senator and president and have a very successful life in politics in the US. So in my picture here, you can see Harry Truman right there in the middle, of course, with the spectacles on, being sworn in is, let's see, what do they call it here? An Eastern judge on the Jackson County Court, which here is kind of like a county commissioner. So it isn't like an actual judge like we would think of it in a court of law, but rather a county commissioner that made administrative decisions, that kind of thing. This is the first real political position that Truman will hold. In 1922, he gets this position, and he gets the endorsement ahead of time so that he's able to win this from the Democratic Party leader in Jackson County in the Kansas City area, a guy named Tom Pendergast. Has anybody ever heard of Tom Pendergast, and what do you know about him?
It sounds familiar. I don't know anything, but it does sound familiar.
Sounds familiar, okay. What else, anybody?
Ran a machine.
He was a party boss, big drinker.
Big drinker. He is a political boss. Yeah. And once he gets in the Senate, will sometimes be called the senator from Pendergast because of the Tom Pendergast endorsement that he has. So Pendergast runs a political machine in Kansas City and Jackson County. And as a result, he's actually the uncle of one of Truman's war buddies. So there is kind of that connection through a friend to Pendergast. So he knew of Truman through his nephew and knew that Truman was honest and a hard worker, which doesn't seem to make sense for a political machine to care about being honest or hardworking. But there is a certain angle that Pendergast sees. So Pendergast thinks that he can attract a different group of voters with Harry Truman running for an office. Truman ends up winning support from both urban, which minorities, and rural constituencies, because of course he's kind of from sort of that farming community. But at the same time, he's hardworking and he's honest, and that kind of picks up these urban working groups as well, which at that point is a little different group of voters than would normally come together for a candidate. So this makes Truman, something worthwhile for the Pendergast machine to look at. So Pendergast, first says, well, there's this position as a county judge. We'll get you in there first. Truman ends up winning that election, runs again and is defeated, but comes back and runs and is given the head seat as county judge. And then from there, it's anybody's guess how quickly he'll become a senator. I actually wanted to run as a representative. Pendergast said, no, I've got a Senate seat that'd be much better for you. So how do political machines work? Does anybody know?
We deliver the votes.
They deliver the votes, but how do they do it?
Sometimes they stuff the ballot box.
Sometimes they stuff the ballot box, true.
They give out political jobs.
They give out political jobs, yeah. So they get somebody into an office through stuffing the ballot box or other means, and then that person has to repay the favor by giving friends or whoever different political positions. And political machines usually have a pretty negative connotation. It doesn't sound like such a good thing. And there's huge ones in New York City and Chicago, in the 1800s and early 1900s. This is not an uncommon thing for a city to have a big political machine that runs the area, essentially. But they can also be good in some ways. In New York, for example, political machines are responsible for giving the poor things like free food handouts when there was no government assistance, things like that. Because the idea is, of course, these might be poor people, they might be immigrants, but they're a vote. So what's it for us to give them a free turkey on Thanksgiving or something? They'll vote for whoever we want them to. But they do also stuff ballot boxes. You're absolutely right. In fact, this is some of this going on during Truman's first election as well, that ballot boxes were stuffed in the days when you could do that. And then, of course, there's this idea that either Truman will end up paying out as a good candidate, right? I don't know if you get to appoint anybody as a county judge, but of course he does become a senator later on. He'll become president later on. And he probably has Tom Pendergast to thank for it. Without him, he probably never would have gotten into politics to begin with and never would have won these positions probably. So I mentioned he lost that re-election bid in 1924. So in between, he ends up selling automobile club memberships. So like I said, he just works these random jobs, whatever he needs to do to make ends meet. And he runs for presiding judge then in 1926 and wins. And that really begins his political career. Low level, as a county judge, he ends up pushing for streets to be redone, kind of civic works projects to be done. That's his big thing in Jackson County. And of course, you can imagine here how this would work. So Truman gets in. A lot of things need to be fixed. Roads need to be redone. Pendergast knows a guy that owns companies that do that. Guess who's going to get those bids? So it works in Truman's favor. It works in Pendergast's favor as well. And Truman will continue to kind of ride that political wave right up to the White House. Because ultimately, the one thing he figures out is that he doesn't like selling automobile club memberships. He doesn't like working at banks. Doesn't like working on the family farm. What he does like is politics and people. And Truman is an honest character, but he is one of these people that will be able to cross the aisle, as they say. and really just have frank discussions with, politicians on both sides to figure out what the best move could be. And in fact, he's so honest that during World War II, when he's still in the Senate, he's put in charge of the Truman Committee, which oversees government funding to projects for World War II, including the Manhattan Project, which builds the first atomic bomb. And of course, Truman doesn't know a lot of the details about it. Most people say he didn't know anything about it until he actually becomes president when FDR dies. But he was in charge of making sure that the money was spent correctly, how it should be spent, because it was government dollars. So he does make some phone calls and ends up, kind of fishing around to say, what's all this money going for? They spent $2 billion at the time on the Manhattan Project, which $2 billion in the 1940s is a lot of money. And Truman says, I need to know what this is going for. And as the story goes, of course, Truman wasn't authorized to have any of the details. But they end up telling him, Mr. Truman, all I can say is it's a war-winning project. And that was apparently enough. Truman bought it and funded the project. And in the end, he will be the one to use it to win World War II when he is president. So kind of interesting how he gets to that point. Now, were there any questions on Truman, his background, family? Like I said, next time we'll probably talk more about the political end of it. Again, you have to unmute yourself. I can't unmute you. Questions, thoughts?
Well, he's kind of indicative of the time, the setting or time. But,
How so?
well, he still had the small farms. He was in a small town, like you say, Independence is now a suburb, but as we've learned to know it in our lifetimes, but type of, and it's kind of, well, you're talking about Pendergast, it's called you hold my hand, I'll hold yours, or whatever you want, however you want to use that term.
Right.
So I just think and I share later what else I've been reading here this morning, or today when you sent the list of books out, I found a few more. But he's an interesting man.
Yeah, anybody else? Questions, or why are you interested in Harry Truman? And I'll make sure we can talk more about that interest next time too.
So I just have always respected all the presidents.
For me, I couldn't really place him in history. I was thinking, well, World War II, sort of, maybe, So I was like, all right, I'm pretty ignorant. We'll listen with the story.
Harry Truman has the unfortunate position of being right after Franklin Roosevelt, who of course is one of the most well-known presidents and probably does the most because he serves the longest of any US president. And Truman, of course, becomes president after Roosevelt dies in office, and Truman finishes out his term and runs for one of his own. But he's kind of between Roosevelt and then Eisenhower, who, whatever, is president, but was a well-known war general. And so quite well-known in his own right. So Truman, really until the 1970s, actually when Truman is going to end up passing away, is when he really starts to gain a lot of new respect. A couple of books are written about him. His daughter Margaret writes a book about him. And, he comes out with his own memoirs right during that same time frame before he passes away. And people kind of learn that, Truman really had to deal with some pretty serious decisions during that late 1940s, early 1950s period. Things which most Americans didn't give a second thought to. For instance, that atomic bomb. Some controversy about how many people it kills. Is it really, an act of war? You're killing civilians too when you drop it. And of course, in all public interviews, Truman always said it was the right decision. Of course, we had to do it. It ended the war. It saved American lives. But in his memoirs, Truman writes about how it kept him up at nights, thinking about, was it the right choice? I mean, we killed all these people, whether they were Japanese or not. So, things like that start to come out during that period. I think Truman gets kind of a new crowd of fans at that point. They start to re-examine what his presidency was really all about.
He really had no background. He was vice president, but he had not really been given any information, particularly. Yeah. So he was kind of dropped into a really unknown situation, so.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about Truman as president next time, but Franklin Roosevelt had a very interesting management style, and that was that Franklin Roosevelt was the master of everything. And although he got information from all of his advisors around him, Franklin Roosevelt believed that he was an expert in everything, that he could be the last say because he knew everything about everything. And so as a result, certain people didn't need to know. So his vice president, who at the end ends up being Harry Truman, didn't need to know about many things. He didn't need to know about the atomic bomb project that was being built. And of course, he had like an inkling of it from being senator and serving on that Truman committee, but he didn't know all the details. And it's one of the things that they tell him when he first gets to the White House that day. They said, "Mr. Truman, we need to talk to you. Like, we've got this project." It isn't too long after that that he ends up using it. That's in April, and by August of that year, the bomb is dropped.
Also, in those days, vice presidents were chosen not as expected to do much. They were chosen a lot of times for the part of the country they came from.
Yeah, vice presidents are chosen strategically. They still are today. If you look at your Kamala Harris pick, you can probably think about the strategy there. What's Joe Biden thinking as far as pulling in different voters? And it's the same when it comes to Franklin Roosevelt. He has several different vice presidents. Roosevelt himself doesn't look great by his last term in office. I don't think he believed that he would die. He probably thought he was pretty immortal. But certainly people close to him believe that. There's one story about Truman going to a party at the White House not long after being chosen as the vice president. And they're going to leave, him and his friend, and they walk out, and his friend says, "Turn around and look at the White House." So of course Truman looks at it, and his friend says, "You're going to be working there in a couple of months." And of course it's very telling because Franklin Roosevelt ends up having, this massive brain hemorrhage and dies. And if you look at pictures of Roosevelt from those last few months, I mean, the man is not well, certainly. But there was this kind of idea and this public mindset that, Roosevelt would never die. This is his fourth term in office. I mean, he was the president. So Truman does have kind of big shoes to fill after that. And I mean, you're right. He didn't have all the information. He wasn't told anything ahead of time for the most part. He kind of had to pick it up on the fly. Yeah, other questions, other thoughts?
In his memoirs, in between dropping the 2 bombs, did he have a lot more, maybe not confidence, but wanting to do the second to end the war?
So the agreement with the atomic bombs was, they kept kind of threatening the Japanese and saying, "Okay, you need to stop doing this, or we're going to use this big weapon on you. We're going to use it." And so, of course, in the end, they don't. And so they dropped the first bomb. And then there was an ultimatum. And they didn't give up yet. So we dropped the second one. And I mean, that was kind of the protocol. And I think Truman saw that the first one worked. Because you got to remember, that was also one of the big questions at that point was, would it work when we go to use it? They had tested a couple of them, but hard to test too many without throwing up some red flags around the world, obviously, that you've got this kind of technology. The Soviets certainly knew, but that's what we had to do. And Truman does stand by that decision. I mean, he says this was the right move. It does end the war. But I think he does question sort of the morality of it, right? Like killing that many people, innocent people. And the targets chosen in Japan were meant to be targets that would really hit hard with society. They weren't necessarily military targets. And there's in fact a big list of areas to bomb. Part of Franklin Roosevelt's time in office, right? He was the one that was supposed to help choose these sites. And then there's big discussions over which cities that they should use it on when the time comes. And there's one discussion with Henry Stinson and Roosevelt, and he says, "Well, don't bomb that. That's where I went on my honeymoon, and it's beautiful. There's so much art and culture," and they don't. They take it off the list, But it was meant to impact the people of Japan. In World War II, the Japanese are such sort of virulent fighters, different from the American sentimentality, right? We'll die for our country, but we want to come home at the end of the day if possible, right? The goal is to live. And with the Japanese, that wasn't so. I mean, it was an honor to die for your country, and that's what you expected to do. So as a result, it was very hard to get them to surrender. And so quite the time frame and quite the decision to be made. But I think Truman ended up standing by it in the end, but definitely had some reservations about the death toll. And of course, Truman didn't get to see many of the after effects that they didn't realize would be caused by radiation and all of that either. Yeah, who else has got a question?
Truman's upbringing was politically very humble, very conservative, as most of the politicians kind of came from eastern big cities. He's a Midwestern person without a lot of political upbringing. It's kind of interesting how he managed to, well, he managed to rise to the top because of Roosevelt's death. But I just thought it was interesting about his path to the presidency. It wasn't great.
Missouri is kind of this interesting sort of kind of Midwestern, kind of Southern region. And it is kind of beneficial to politicians because you have this sort of Midwestern mentality, but at the same time, you can sort of sway these Southern thinking types. And Truman definitely plays that up. His sort of skill with minorities, but also with the rural areas, because he could claim he was a country boy too, and working to his benefit, certainly in those lower positions. And then once you get to the Senate, I think by then he sort of won out as being an honest and hardworking person. And this is still a time in Washington when there was some value to that, I think.
Might also be, it's interesting, I'm just thinking of it, alternating, because Roosevelt, of course, represented the different strata of the East, of education, and maybe if you want to say money and all the varieties, whole different growth. And then, but the one prior to that was Hoover. And Hoover's background is Iowa, both Midwestern. So at this time, it's also indicative of the growth of our country, our changing of probably of where people are from and backgrounds. And I can't remember Hoover's education at this point offhand, but
yeah, Herbert Hoover also has some humble beginnings as a Quaker in Iowa. And if you go and visit, the homestead and his library there, you can see just what humble beginnings he had. But he actually ends up becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world by the point that he's president. He's a surveyor, does land surveying and trying to find precious metals and gold in Australia and places like that, and is very, very knowledgeable on the economy. gets the raw deal with the Great Depression there. But Franklin Roosevelt is a different character. Here's somebody who, when he thought of the presidency, he thought of himself. I mean, he really envisioned himself as president, and there just was nobody else. I mean, he took lessons on how to speak to different kinds of people, how to speak when you were in public. I mean, he really wanted that persona, and came from oodles of money, of course. And to pick Truman, probably because obviously a different voter base than Roosevelt would pull in. And by that point, of course, this is years after Roosevelt and his New Deal first came into office. We're in this war period now. Roosevelt had lost a good number of his supporters by that last term that he was running. So picking Truman made sense. You were going to get a different group of people. Many people probably thought, well, I mean, how old is Roosevelt now? Is he really going to be around? Who else could work? Truman's honest and he's hardworking. He's no Roosevelt, but I think he had his own sort of standards that were appealing to many people.
Oh, I see. That's John Lewis's.
Any questions on Bess, Margie, the family?
well, Margaret went on to being quite a well-known musician.
Margaret, that's her career, yep. Despite the criticism.
Well,
What'd you think of Truman's piano playing?
not bad.
Not bad.
Well,
Better than the singing, I felt.
Terry didn't like it. Better than the singing, maybe. Yeah, and I was going to show you a little clip here. Let's see if it works. I couldn't get it into my PowerPoint, so I'll have to show you the website, but it is Truman explaining the whole Give 'em Hell, Harry campaign of 1948 and kind of where that name came from. So let's see here. All right, 1 second, let me see. All right, here we go. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
All right, let's see if we can hear.
I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, making a speech on this campaign, and some big voice, bull voice bird way up in the corner of that 7,000 people auditorium said, "Give 'em hell, Harry." Well, I never gave anybody hell. I just told the truth on these fellows, and they thought it was hell. That's all there was to it. I'm coming out here so you can look at me and hear what I have to say, and then make up your own minds as to whether you believe some of the same things that have been said about your president. I've been in politics a long time, and it makes no difference what they say about you if it isn't so. If they can prove it on you, you're in a bad fix indeed. I know. They've never been able to prove it on me. We've traveled about 8,300 miles. I've made 140 talks and speeches, and I've seen at least 2 million people or more. And I believe that the people are beginning to wake up to the fact that this is a real crusade. It's the people against the special interests, and we've got to fight that out to the end if it takes all of it. At 6 o'clock I was defeated. 10 o'clock I was defeated. 12 o'clock I was defeated. 4 o'clock I'd won the election. And the next morning, the morning after that in St. Louis, there was handed this paper which said, "Dewey defeats Truman." Of course, he wished he had, but he didn't, and that's all there was to it.
I'm glad of this.
So there you go. Somebody yelled out, "Give 'em hell."
What was the vote total difference between Truman and Dewey? Was
Oh, I'd have to go back and check for next time for sure. We can talk about that. But yeah, one of the most famous elections probably in history, just because, of course, the person who everybody assumed was going to win didn't. And they had actually printed out papers that they were so confident that it was going to happen. And Truman, of course, famously holds it up and, so he is the winner there. Thomas Dewey with Michigan connections himself down in Owasso, right? You can walk by the Dewey house down there. But yeah, 1948, Truman's election. And this is kind of the point where people, Harry Truman, I mean, yeah, he was FDR's vice president. He's no FDR. So of course you've got Thomas Dewey in there. But Truman ends up being kind of that scrappy guy. He's kind of funny. You can tell from that clip that he had a pretty good sense of humor. And ends up coming out and having his own presidency. Does a lot of great things in his time, of course, desegregates the military, ends up getting to use that atomic bomb to finish out FDR's term, all of that. And then, of course, has some low points too, which we'll have to talk more about next time for sure. But he ends up being one of the lowest ranked presidents during the 1950s, thanks to Korea. But more on that in MacArthur. More on that next time for sure. But yeah, so I mean, you can kind of tell there from Truman talking a little bit. That's why I showed you the rest of the clip. I mean, pretty down to earth. Didn't take any speaking lessons, not like FDR. Told it like it was and told some good jokes, and seemed to have a good time in life. Hot-tempered, of course. The buck stops here is his famous desk quote, of course, that he had on that plaque on his desk. Everybody's familiar with that. And unlike FDR, Truman really didn't see himself as being an expert in anything. I mean, he wasn't, when you think about it. He knew that. There was no mystery to that. And he really did lean on some of these experts around him and advisors. Certainly when FDR had passed away and he still had these people surrounding him, I mean, he needed them. And so he leaned on them, but when he made that final decision, that was it. But he definitely took into account everybody's expertise on the subject first, because he kind of thought that was the right way to do it, right? So the buck stops here, but I'm going to listen to everybody that has something to say about it first. Truman went back home to independence after he's done being president too. We'll talk more about the politics part next time, but he ends up going back home and is glad to be back home and intends to get a job when he goes back home because, of course, now you're done being president, it's time for a different job to help support your family. And he's actually the first president where they end up paying him a post-presidential salary so that he can retire. Before that, of course, you either came from money and had money, so it didn't matter once you were done being president, you could retire. Or like Truman, you had to go find another job. So Truman was going to sell cars, and I believe he did for a little while after being president before that came through. But he ends up getting paid, I believe it's $2,500 a month post-president. And lives out his years in independence when they built his presidential library, which you can go visit, still there. He actually had an office put in it, and he worked there every day. He was often the first person in the door and the last person to leave at night. And he would even answer the phones. So that's where he ended up writing his memoirs and doing all that research work, and where he's buried too.
I understood he was a very, very frugal man. He and Bess drove themselves home after he finished his presidency and turned over the White House to.
Right, very, very frugal.
Yes.
And I mean, and it comes from that background of not having any money, right? I mean, this guy was always hustling to make ends meet. And I mean, even though Bess technically kind of came from money, I mean, her family itself by that point, when she and Truman got together, really didn't have any either. And so they end up living in this, house, which of course was her mother's house and their grandmother's house, and they just kind of took it over once those people died and lived there as well. And it's a beautiful home, and it's probably one of the bigger homes at that point in time, independence. But I mean, that wasn't their money, right? They didn't have that. So it is kind of interesting that he keeps that very common sense, down to earth mentality and says, well, I'm just going to go back and get a job. That's what I got to do,
Is it true that Bess's mother did not care for him? And also, like, he proposed a lot of times, but she had other suitors. And then when his father committed suicide, back in the day, it was sort of a stigma on a family.
So it was a stigma that her father committed suicide. Very looked at with a lot of pity, I guess you could say, right? The kids in that family. And Bess became a little more subdued after that because of that reason. She had been, pretty outspoken young woman. And like I said, she was quite smart. She intended to go, but they didn't have the money for it. But, at that point, that's when she kind of becomes a little bit more quiet. And you can Google some film clips of her and Harry once they're retired, living out the rest of their life. And I mean, you can tell that she's a pretty feisty lady too. So you certainly kind of don't see that. But it's true. Her mom didn't really care for Truman. Probably because, of course, she looked at him kind of like her own husband, somebody who was always hustling for a different job and never really made any money. But Truman worked hard, unlike her husband, was successful in politics. So she really didn't have a choice, right? Bess stuck with him. And they wrote lots of letters back and forth to each other. I would have to say that Harry and Bess were probably true loves. She didn't care much for Washington, so she didn't stay there long. Her and Margaret went back to independence. And it killed Harry when they were apart, and they wrote letters back and forth to each other, love letters. So I think somebody even wrote a book about it, if I recall, or some book, letters to Bess.
Betty and I visited the Wallace home in Independence as well as the library, but the home was very nice looking from the outside. But I think the furnishings on the inside reflected that there hadn't been any changes. No new paint, no new wallpaper. Their kitchen was small and humble. It was interesting.
2 chairs at the table.
Yeah, there were 2 chairs at the kitchen table, and it was it needed an upgrade.
I will tell you, when I visited the Gates Mansion, as it's known officially, in Independence, the first thing I noticed, which is probably a weird first thing to notice, but you walk right in, at that point you did anyways for like your tour, like the door by the kitchen, is that on the table there's like a toaster and there's place settings. Well, and then there's a pair of metal tongs to get your toast out of the toaster with.
Yeah.
And so I said to my tour guide, who was like a park ranger, I'm like, you know, did they really use those metal tongs? And he's like, yes, those are actually their tongs. So it's a wonder he didn't get electrocuted, is all I'm saying.
Did you remember seeing Harry's car in the garage?
Oh, you know, I don't remember the car.
Well, I think it was, wasn't it, Alan?
Yeah, I believe so. There was
an old something in the 40s, probably.
just a single car garage out in the back of the yard.
Yeah.
And anyway.
Yeah, the one thing that sets aside the Gates Mansion, which was common for that time frame, is that if it was built by somebody who was well off, which of course the Gates family was at that point in time, you put stained glass in your house because this was considered a sign of wealth. So if you look at it, it has some stained glass windows, which is supposed to show off its elegance. It's definitely old. I'm sure that Truman probably kept it up, but you know, you didn't need fancy things. You just had to live a good life. And Truman does live a long life too. I mean, he's done being president to live into the 1970s.
Somebody asked about the election results, 1948. I have that.
Somebody look it up. What'd you find?
Yes, I have. Truman had 24,106,000. Dewey, 21,969,170. And there were two other candidates. Strom Thurmond got over 1 million votes, and Henry Wallace got over 1 million votes. And electoral votes, Truman had 303, and Dewey won Michigan and kind of the Northeast corridor, and the Henry Wallace, the progressive, won, or Strom Thurmond won some of the southern states.
Of course.
That's it.
There you go. Yeah, they weren't quite like 2 votes off or anything, you know, them, but you know, all the polls came back saying that it was going to be Dewey. But Harry got the last laugh on that one. So for next time, anything in particular that you'd like to know more about as far as his political career? That way I can make sure to include it. Or anything you're just wondering in specific?
I think, was it Truman the one who went to Key West?
Truman went to Key West, yeah.
Okay.
Had the Southern White House down there.
Well, and it was that watershed time after the war, and I've picked up and I'm reading as memoirs here, and that's, he's talking about the time, and I'll share with you, you're welcome, the election of 52, which is when he was going out then and so on. I'm going, it's kind of like, so what else is new? But well, it was very much a discord within the parties and so on. Of, but it was a really changing time. And
yeah, Truman was grandfathered in. They changed the law on running for president, so you can only serve 2 terms in office during the end of Roosevelt's last term.
Yeah.
I think this is crazy. So, but Truman was grandfathered in at that point.
Yeah.
He could have continued to run, but of course he said no. Right?
Because
Done.
he was only elected for one. The other one he had served most of the full term for.
Yep, FDR was reelected in 1944 and died in April of 45.
There is, since Truman did serve in World War I, there's a very nice renovated World War I museum in Kansas City. And anyone traveling that way would be well served to take a look at it. It's been reworked, remodeled, and it's it's very much worthwhile.
Isn't that quite new, Alan?
Well, it was built earlier, and I don't know the dates, but then it just kind of went into disrepair, lack of interest, and then it has since been rejuvenated. And again, it's very, very worthwhile.
Yeah, because I think on my time through there, usually I don't remember ever catching anything of it, and then it's all of a sudden showed up on the radar back within the last dozen years or so. So my memorable point of it is the time that I was in Iowa, coming back across Iowa, and it's just about the time that Ellen and Betty and I learned to know each other. But and they were dedicating the Hoover Library, and they were flying Truman and Hoover in and landing at the airport. And I always kept trying to think back to it. In the early 60s, it was a 6-cylinder car, had to have been AM radio only, no air conditioning. This time of year, hotter than you know what. But it's kind of a memory of some of those things. So
Makes the corn grow.
Yes.
Yeah, speaking of Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman, so of course Franklin Roosevelt previously had defeated Herbert Hoover for his re-election campaign, and Roosevelt wins, and the New Deal and all that jazz fixes the Great Depression, of course. So Harry Truman actually used Herbert Hoover as a financial economic advisor for the country he was president. So it wasn't that Hoover didn't know what he was doing, it was just the wrong position at the wrong time. But for that, you'll have to read more on Herbert Hoover.
Yeah.
I've been to the Hoover Presidential Museum as well. And so much like the metal toast tongs I took away from the Harry Truman house, from the Hoover Museum, I took away all the wax figures of Hoover wearing a suit, a full suit to fly fish. I thought that was very odd.
Oh.
I focus on the wrong things when I go to these places, but no, if you go to Independence, I mean, I was there obviously a number of years ago at this point, maybe a decade ago at this point, but I mean, you can walk around and walk the same streets that Harry Truman did every morning, go for a long walk after he had his toast and a shot of bourbon to get the day. He'd go out for his long walk and talk to people and get his paper and make his way to his office in his library. But, you know, could have moved to a big city and could have had a whole different life after being president, and really wanted to go back to the life that he had before that. Well, any other things to cover next time or questions?
Just one more thing. I tallied up those votes for the candidates, and the other 3 candidates combined had more votes than Harry Truman.
Yeah.
So, life goes on.
There you go. It's all about those main party candidates. Hard to win as a third party. They keep trying.
I guess I'd like to know about the Korean War and how we got into that, because pretty much the TV series MASH is my history of the Korean War.
Yeah.
Well, what war, right? That's a police action.
Yeah.
We could talk about the Korean War for sure. That's their first test of police action. First non-war. Yeah,
in Tuesday's Saginaw News was an article about, forgotten how it's headed. I've kind of laid it out because I thought of this, and it mentioned some of the things and the things that came along then, because that was, of course, definitely the post-war time.
Mm-hmm.
So that, you know, some of the, I forget, the Marshall Plan may predate him, but there were several other things. I think the World Health, other things around the world that he helped engineer and, you know, and see to it that they were. It's a neat. You might appreciate that one. So.
Okay.
Catherine, we have a question about Truman's emotional feelings after the releasing of the atomic bombs, whether or not he had written anything related to how he felt about the results of that. I don't recall ever seeing anything.
I mean, not to my knowledge, right after it happens. Like I know that in press interviews and things, of course, he sticks that, it was the right choice. And of course, he didn't have to think twice about it. He made the right decision. I just know that he talks in his memoirs about, kind of being kept up nights, thinking about this and was it really the right choice? And he believed it was, but he just felt badly about all the death that it caused, But at the time, no, I think he very much stick to his guns on that one. And who knows what he really felt, Bess probably knew, but she didn't write it down either, so.
Okay.
Just remember, he was also a World War I veteran. He had been in war.
He had been in war, yeah, knew the consequences for sure. I mean, the other thing about warfare at that point in time, World War I, World War II, and previous, is you have to remember that war was looked at a little differently than it is today, than it has been since Vietnam, really. And I mean, war was a glorious thing. Yes, there was death involved, and of course that was horrible on some level. But I mean, it was in some ways an honor. If you died for your country, that was okay. We hoped you came home, but it might happen. And of course, we were always the victor, so we liked that too. We seemed to win until, of course, Korea, and that will definitely change some mindsets as well. And then Vietnam kind of sends that feeling home too, right? And that kind of changes our thoughts on war in this country and our feelings towards whether it's always the best choice to go to war. Suddenly war takes on a much more negative feeling than it used to have. All right, so World War II was kind of that last great war. The atomic bomb is certainly a dramatic end to it. I'll say that much. And certainly kind of an awful end. But at the same time, I mean, I'm sure it was thought at pretty positively. I mean, it ended the war. That was it, right? I mean, that was really the holdout was Japan. And they start, dividing up Europe. And that's when you get the Marshall Plan and all that comes into play.
Now, Catherine, I have not spent a lot of time researching history. I need to go do that in my spare time. But one of the things I thought I had read about was, and I don't see it discussed much, is that at least there was also an assessment of how many lives would be lost for a full invasion of Japan.
There was, yeah. They did a lot of tabulations. In theory, if they had to do, land combat, right? So people actually get on the islands and attack in full force. They claimed that far more casualties would be had that way. So that was one of the theories on using the bomb, is that in some ways it was a little bit more targeted, of course, radiation aside, because I didn't understand any of that at the time, is that it would kill less people and it would save more American lives, definitely in the long run, which I guess technically it did. But yeah, they had planned for a land invasion.
Yeah. Which sounds maybe clinically correct, but when you look at what actually happened, it was still an amazing amount of devastation. It's probably like that. It's like, well, it may make sense in the conference room, but when you look at it, it still doesn't feel good.
Well, and you have to remember, I mean, Truman wasn't behind the creation of the atomic bomb. This was a Roosevelt project for sure. And the whole plan was to beat the Germans because they were working on it too. And so of course we do. And Truman is the one that actually gets, the notification, right? Things work, the bomb works. Roosevelt gets told, we're working on it. And so Truman gets that choice to use it. And I mean, I guess you put all this money towards building it. You probably should use it. And Truman, who had served on that Truman committee, probably on some level had to think back and say, I know how much money was spent on this through the years, right? But I mean, you've got advisors. Truman was a soldier in the Army. He was a captain, but, battle commanders and people working on all that strategy, I'm sure had to tell him that this was the best choice. I mean, that's usually how he worked. He didn't just sit in his room by himself and make that decision. So there must have been lots of statistics and numbers run and all sorts of things, I'm sure. But I know, I mean, it's kind of hard to believe, but I know that the thoughts on the Japanese, that they were such dedicated fighters that they just would never give up, that the war would never end if they didn't have some sort of big weapon like that to use. Because even they thought, I think, with a land attack, that it wouldn't necessarily work. I mean, a lot of people could die doing that, and if you didn't capture the emperor that you still wouldn't be successful. So, and then of course we worry about nuclear war for the next several decades, which never happens. Truman's really the only person that ever got to use the atomic bomb.
Let's hope.
Let's hope. I guess, yeah, you can still
Yeah, you
use them. I
have
think
to
they
add
lost
so
their
far.
they lost their luxury after other countries figured out how to build them. It doesn't take too long. By 1949, the Soviets have one.
Yeah, I was going to say the Russians were in close competition there and still probably have the most.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I wrote down a couple things for next time. We'll talk more about politics and his presidency and I guess wars next time. And we'll kind of discuss, you know, Harry Truman as a politician and his presidential management style and all of that in detail and how he kind of fits between Franklin Roosevelt and of course Dwight Eisenhower on the other end as president too. So if you think of anything that you're just dying to know more about in between, drop me an email. You all know how to find my email out there. It's in every OLLI publication, I'm sure. Or call the office if nothing else. And let me know. Because I'm going to work on that probably tomorrow and next week. And if you come up with anything else you want added in, I'm happy to talk more about that too. Sounds good?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
All right. Well, everybody have a good day, a good Thursday. If you're bored, you can go hit up the Hemlock Farmers Market today from 4 to 7. So,
Yep.
Sounds good.
and I'll see you next week at 2 o'clock. Use the same Zoom link that you had for. It'll be good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Have a good day, guys.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.